Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this SAIEE KZN Centre webinar dealing with the integration of distributed energy resources, solar PV. My name's Rob Stephen. I'm not your host, but I will be handing over to Shepherd Nkosi, the chairman of the KZN Centre. Shepherd, over to you as the host. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen, and a warm welcome to everyone this afternoon. We warmly welcome you as the KZN Centre, and I know there's members connected globally. We welcome you all. Maybe just for formalities and as part of our safety brief, we're just reminding all of us, let's maybe quickly go through the webinar information. We're reminding all of you to please mute your phone while the webinar is on, if it's possible. And we are also requesting attendees are reminded to ensure that your volume is turned up on their devices, and you are reminded to ensure that you have a stable internet connection. This will ensure the streaming and audio that the streaming and audio will run smooth, and attendees can ask questions via the question panel located within the GoToWebinar control panel. By default, the control panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat function is reserved for the webinar organizers and the panelists to communicate with attendees. So attendees will not be able to chat with each other. However, you are encouraged to ask questions. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the SAIEE YouTube channel and SAIEE TV under the webinar producer name, that is the KZN Centre playlist. This channel is updated regularly, so ensure you check back on it often, as soon as possible for new uploads. Please click on the link that will appear in the chat box shortly to subscribe to the SAIEE TV channel, and it's a free channel. So we'll drop the link maybe during the discussion. You can see the link and you can click on it to also subscribe there. A certificate of attendance will be issued a few weeks after this webinar once you have received the CDP. We've received the CDP validation number from EXA. So we'll make this readily available for those that would like to claim the CPD points. Thank you. So I would like now to go straight to our speaker, and then maybe before we do that, I will do a quick introduction of the panelists. I'm assisted by Dr. Rob Stephen, and Dr. Rob Stephen is one of the seasoned engineer around KZN. So Dr. Stephen was born in Joburg, South Africa. He holds a BSc and a Master's MS MBA degree, as well as a PhD in the overhead line design. He retired from Eskom on 31st January 2020, where he held the position of the Master Specialist in the Technology Group, responsible for distribution and transmission technologies of all voltages, covering both AC and DC. He was also responsible for the smart grid strategy for Eskom. He is the past chairman of SIGRI Study Committee B2 on the overhead lines, and has held positions in SIGRI of special reporter and also working group chairman, and has authored over 100 technical papers. He was the international president of the SIGRI from 2016 to 2020. He is a fellow of the South African Institute of the Electrical Engineers, and also a member of the KZN SAIEE. And he was awarded the President Award in 2016. He's currently a specialist academic advisor at the UKZN of Kwa-Zulu Natal. Thank you, Dr. Steve. So Dr. Steve will be coming later when we do the question and answer. And please join me in welcoming our guest speaker this afternoon, Lishan Modila. And Lishan Modila is the project executive from eThekwini. He has got a BSc in engineering, and after graduating with a BSc in engineering degree 15 years ago, Lishan has focused his time and energy on specializing in the electricity pricing and renewable strategy. Also, while South Africa recovers from an energy constraint, Lishan has capitalized on the need to promote renewable energy in a cost-reflective and efficient manner, whilst balancing the social dynamic of providing essential services to the city of eThekwini. Lishan is also active on numerous national and international energy platforms and continues to extract and build on this experience to uplift the renewable energy sector within the city, and obviously for our space, which is South Africa. Lishan has the ambition to drive the city to promote renewable energy or energy technologies and integrate higher quality green power into the grid. This is an enormous task, you'll agree with me, and which Lishan chooses to accept as a challenge rather than a barrier. Please welcome me in welcoming Lishan. Lishan, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shepherd, and it's a very good afternoon, colleagues. It's great to be here with you all today in talking about the approach that we're going to be taking as eThekwini municipality as we pave the way for renewable energy within the city. So today I'm scheduled with you for an hour or so, and I'm going to try not to put you guys off to sleep this afternoon. And I'm going to try and give you an overview of what it is that we're trying to do as a municipality in responding to the various challenges when it comes to renewable energy. And I'm sure, as you can imagine, there's various aspects that we need to look into as a municipality. And unfortunately, we don't have the time today to go into all of the stuff in detail, but the area that we will be concentrating on is the area around the integration of embedded generation to the city, and there'll be a specific focus on solar PV. Colleagues, I want to say to you up front that when we came together as a city in terms of putting together this framework, the aim was not to look for a perfect solution, and the idea was that we were aiming for a fair, transparent, and for a smooth transition into renewable energy. The truth is, I think we all know where we are, and we know where we want to get to when it comes to renewable energy. But it seems like there is a gap between where we are and where we need to get to. And we've then launched this framework as a plan of action for us within the municipality to ensure that we have a guide in taking us from where we are to where we need to get to over the next couple of years. So colleagues, that's pretty much where we are and what I'd like to be talking to you around today. Just as a brief overview before we get into the topic of embedded generation, I'd like to just maybe share with you our thoughts around three aspects for the municipality, which we're looking at in quite a bit of detail. And the first aspect is looking at the financial sustainability of the municipality. Now, there's been a lot going on within the electricity supply industry over the last few years, and we have been expected to respond on numerous fronts when it came to these issues. And I think renewable energy came and presented the biggest amount of challenges in terms of changing the way we operate as a distribution utility. Things were quite easy in the past. We just bought electricity from Eskom, we distributed that bits of electricity, and we then sold it on to the end customer. Things have changed to a large extent right now. And within the ambit of financial sustainability, we are looking at 4 areas. The first one being embedded generation, and that's what we'll talk further on in the session today. But the second area that we feel that we need to respond to as a municipality when it comes to securing our financial sustainability is looking at alternate energy procurement. and I'm quite happy to announce that we've progressed quite far when it comes to this aspect. The Energy Office of eThekwini Municipality has recently launched a request for information where we're looking to procure 400 megawatts of alternate energy for the city. Now, this is in response to the Section 34 determination that's been made by our Minister of TMRE. And as a city, we are trying it for the first time, and I think we're the first in the country to try and see whether we can get this process right. So we're out there and we're trying to then procure 400 megawatts of alternate electricity. This platform is specifically aimed for those that want to be pure generators within the city. The embedded generation platform is more aimed at behind the meter generation. So these will be aimed at prosumer type customers. And these are the two platforms that we're actually launching to ensure that we can bring renewable energy onto the grid. The third area that we want to target and try and create a framework around is around wheeling of electricity. And ever since we saw changes to Schedule 2 of the Electricity Regulation Act, where we saw that the threshold for the licensing exemption moved from 1 megawatt up to 100, there's been a host of activity around the wheeling of electricity, and we just started to get more and more queries around creating wheeling frameworks within the city. And I think it's quite understandable. We've unlocked the generation sector to a large extent within the country. And obviously where there's generation, that electricity needs to be transmitted, it needs to be distributed and consumed. And we find ourselves in a situation where we cannot necessarily evacuate the electricity where it's generated, and hence there's a need for wheeling frameworks within the country. So we're actually working on a wheeling framework within the municipality, and we're hoping then to make a presentation to the National Energy Regulator of South Africa in the next financial year. Colleagues, then still within financial sustainability is the issue around alternate energy generation. We have an appetite as a city to look at our own generation platforms, and this is different to alternate energy procurement because in this situation, we would like to own the infrastructure and the assets. But considering where we are in terms of our financial positions and the difficult sort of economic climate that we find ourselves in, I think this part of the project is going to be parked for a while, and we're going to look at the other sort of aspects. The last area under financial sustainability that we're looking at is the area of energy storage. And I think it's quite important that we start looking in this direction, because if we look at our counterparts internationally, we've noted that as we introduce more and more variable like electricity to the grid, there is a dire need for a balancing mechanism, and there needs to be different means of energy storage to try and play this part. So we've got energy storage as our short-term plan, and we're hoping then to launch a study very soon in terms of dealing with energy storage. So colleagues, that's pretty much the aspects around financial sustainability that we're looking at as a municipality. And we're also in the process of updating our cost of supply study, and that then is going to add great weight in ensuring that we can keep and remain sustainable within the municipality. Just in terms of looking at the next area where we see importance in terms of sustainability, and that's around the technical sustainability for the municipality. And obviously you will agree that this is around the connection of variable technologies to the grid. Things do change when you bring on board this types of technology, and we're looking at three areas here, the one being network strengthening, the second one being the planning philosophy, and the third one being the technical standards. So we do have colleagues within the municipality that are specializing in these areas, and we're hoping then to strengthen ourselves when it comes to technical sustainability within the municipality. The third area, which I think is going to come in the near future, is the issue around looking at diversification options for the municipality. If you look at our counterparts internationally, once again, they started off as being pure distribution utilities like ourselves, and as more and more variable renewable energy came onto the grid, they started to then diversify their business model to look at other avenues to generate revenue. Now, it's something that we'd like to do within the sort of municipal space, but obviously we're still within a very tight regulatory framework, and it might be a bit more difficult for us to adopt in South Africa at this point in time. But nevertheless, our thoughts are still out there, and we're hoping then to put down a few of our diversification options to ensure that we can diversify our business stream if need be going into the future. So colleagues, that's pretty much an overview of what we're trying to do and our approach from a holistic point of view in responding to renewable energy. And the topic for today, though, is talking specifically around the embedded generation. And then to kick off, I'd like then to maybe go into the sort of introductory slide, just to maybe stimulate some conversation in leading us up to the embedded generation framework that we're talking about. And the question I'd like to pose is, how do we contribute to a sustainable city? And as being the electricity department and being the electrical engineers of the city, there's 4 aspects that we need to do to ensure that we contribute to sustainability within the city. The first aspect, obviously, is to provide electricity to the people. And I'm quite happy to say that 75% of the citizens and the households within eThekwini have access to the grid. Now, the balance of the 25%, we're currently working on them, and it's posing a lot of challenges to us because the majority of the people that fall within the sector fall within the informal settlement sort of arena. And as you can imagine, these settlements are not built as per the normal standards, and they're not necessarily built in the correct places. So we're having a challenge in terms of where these settlements are. They're obviously built in private properties, they're built on road reserves, and it's very difficult then for us to go and electrify. But notwithstanding the challenges, we're continuing with our mandate in terms of providing services to the people. The second area in terms of securing sustainability to the city is to ensure that we can keep the lights on within the city. And this now links directly to the technical stability of the network. And I recall when I joined the municipality almost 13 years ago, the head of department at the time said to me, do you know that 99% of the houses have electricity 99% of the time? And really, that was very true at the time, to be quite honest. But in saying that, we are currently facing huge amounts of theft. We're facing large amounts of vandalism on the network. We've also got load shedding to take into consideration. So those percentages may have changed just a little bit, but by and large, we are keeping the lights on within the city. So currently, 2 of our mandates in terms of contributing to sustainability of the city has now been met. The third aspect, and I think a very important aspect if you look at the rising prices of electricity in the country, was to keep prices as low as we can. And this is a slide that was shared with me yesterday by a colleague of mine, Stephen Delport. And Stephen has been very active in keeping track of all the electricity tariffs in the country. And if you take a look at this graph, and it's just looking at a load of 3.7 MVA at a load factor of 60%. If this load was modeled on the Eskom Megaflex tariff, the cost would be just over 26 million Rand per annum. And if we then model the similar load on the tariff structure of the city of Amsterdam, which is Richards Bay, which is just north of Durban, you will see that the annual cost of that customer would be just over 30 million. And third up, you'll see there's eThekwini with a cost just over 30 million as well. You can then see that if you compare us to the rest of our colleagues in the country, we have been carrying out our role to ensure that we're on the lower or on the cheaper end of the spectrum when it came to pricing our tariffs. And I'm by no means trying to compete or to compare with my fellow metros or municipalities, but I think the point here is to just highlight that we've been carrying out our mandate in ensuring that we can keep electricity prices as low as we can. So things have been going really well, to be quite honest. And the fourth part that we need to look at is maintaining grid access and grid sustainability. And I think this is where we start to get very nervous, or we start to get very concerned as municipal officials now when we look at the slide. This is a slide that looks at the 20-year analysis of the amount of electricity that came into the city. And what you'll see very clearly from the slide is that in the year starting off from 2000, 2001, look up until 2007, 2008, we enjoyed very good growth in the city. And we noticed at the time that the growth of electricity was highly linked to the growth of GDP. And it was a good time for the municipalities because we were able to generate good amounts of revenues, and we were able to put back that revenues into the maintenance and the repairs of our networks. Sadly, though, after 2008, we started to see a steady decline in terms of the amount of electricity that we started to procure as the city. And if we then go on to look at the last 2 bars of the graph, it paints a very worrying picture because we must probably now back down to the amount of electricity that we consumed in 2003, 2004. Now, the problem with this is that our cost structure is not going back to the ages of 2003 and 2004. Yet our sales or our purchases of electricity is now regressing down back to that point. And this is very scary because we now have a declining sales or a declining purchasing trend against an inclining cost structure. And when you have this happening, we are going to end up with spiraling electricity prices, and we're going to then price ourselves outside of the market. And whilst I'm hoping that we're going to see some type of recovery in terms of the economy to ensure that our purchases of electricity start to go up, at this point in time, we're very concerned in terms of the picture that's being painted right now. So colleagues, with that being said, I'd like then to come back to the question that's going to lead us into the talk around embedded generation. And the question really is, how much or how do we manage further decline due to renewable energy? And I think that's the question that we need to be able to ask ourselves. So with that question in mind, I'd like then to move on and start the conversation around the embedded generation. And when we're going to talk about embedded generation today, I'm going to cover 5 aspects. The one is going to be understanding embedded generation as a disruptor. 2, I'm going to talk to you around trying to understand the approach that we've taken as a municipality to deal with embedded generation. The third aspect I'm going to talk to you about is understanding the financial risk to us as a municipality as we integrated more of renewable energy onto the grid, specifically solar PV. Then I'll go on talking to you about understanding the solution. And then finally, I'll end off the presentation by talking to you around the impact of the solution to the municipality. All right, so if we can very quickly get into the first slide, and you guys may be familiar, just a few years back, there was a buzzword in the industry calling solar PV a disruptor, and it brought about quite a bit of a sort of attention, and we started to read about it on the internet about how solar PV is going to disrupt the entire status quo of distribution utilities, and we took those words quite seriously, I must say, and we really wanted to understand what this disruption was. We needed to get down to first principles to understand how is it that this integration of solar PV was going to interrupt or disrupt us as distribution utilities. And as a result of that, we launched a study. And the purpose of the study was twofold. One was to understand the risk that's associated with the integration of solar PV to the grid. And specifically, we were looking around the financial risks of PV introduction. And we obviously know that when there's disruption, it does create risk, but at the same time, it creates opportunity. And we're then very interested to look at the opportunities that we will be able to create, both from an economic point of view, as well as that of an environmental point of view. So that was pretty much the purpose of our study. And that's pretty much how we looked at launching the study for the municipality. The study has been taken from a point of view of a distribution business. Look, and I assume that if we're looking at the study from a generator, from a customer point of view, it might be very different. But look, I would think that the outcome of the study then is not really going to change. All right, so let's then get into some of the key questions that we needed to ask ourselves when we looked at the study. And we took a real logical approach when it came around this issue. And the first aspect was, we knew that the introduction, or we sort of knew that there's an introduction of small-scale embedded generation, and that was sort of becoming more and more pronounced as time went on. And what we wanted to understand is why. Why is there this huge rush all of a sudden for small-scale embedded generation? We then went on to ask ourselves the question, well, if we did see this large-scale introduction of small-scale embedded generation, then what change are we expecting to see in the electricity sector? After that, we went on to say, well, if there's going to be a change in the electricity sector, how then is this going to disrupt our traditional electricity tariff structures? Once we're done with that, then we started around this conversation, which is termed the utility debt spiral. And it became quite an interesting term, and it's something that we went and investigated. And we wanted to understand then what was the impact of the debt spiral, and we also then wanted to understand then what was the solutions to the debt spiral. We then went on to look at what are the best practice approaches in terms of finding solutions to the problems that we had. And then finally, we wanted to link all of this back to the renewable energy targets that we had as a municipality. All right, so let's maybe then get straight into the first one and take a very quick dive and a quick view as to why is it that we found a huge amount of interest into small-scale embedded generation. The first thing that we saw happening was there was amendments to Schedule 2 of the Electricity Regulation Act. And initially, it was set at 1 megawatt. Thereafter, there was talk at 10 megawatt. And eventually, we settled on talking at 100 megawatts, where you were exempt from a licensing process, and you were then requested to go and apply for a regulatory registration process. Now, this, I think, was a real game changer for the private sector in terms of bringing on board privatized generation. And we've noticed that after the Act started to undergo these changes, we started to see more and more queries within the municipality when it came to privatized generation. The second area that I think gave some seriousness to privatized generation in the country was the fact that it was the first time that we saw in the integrated resource plan that there was mention of embedded generation. It was never done before. And I think this was almost like sealing the deal for the private sector and saying, well, our national government is now taking privatized generation seriously. And what we saw in the 2019 IRP, that there was an allowance for 500 megawatts of embedded generation annually from 2023 up until 2030. Personally, I think these were the two major sort of impact factors that brought around great amount of interest into the generation space. And thereafter, some of the other things, which is the carbon tax, while it's not yet released in the country, we know it's looming and that's going to have an impact on many customers. We also found that that funding for renewable energy systems became a whole lot easier. I mean, now you can knock on the door of your bank manager and you'll be able to find funding for your renewable energy systems. Thereafter, we saw that these systems now came with 25-year warranties, something that wasn't here 5 to 7 years ago. So we're finding that people are building more confidence in the fact that they're getting localized warranties going up to 25 years. Thereafter, quite unexpected, but the South African Revenue Services, SARS, they also came on board and they launched a current tax incentive 12B that allows for the full depreciation of your generation asset in year 1. And then finally, I think a very big push people to start looking at small-scale embedded generation as well as large-scale generation was the cost price dynamic that we had going on in South Africa. Now, if you take a look at the cost of technology, which is the graph on the left-hand side, you'll see when compared to 2010, the cost of solar PV has dropped by more than 70%. And when you look at the price of electricity, which is a graph on your right-hand side, you'll see that the price of electricity has increased by more than 150% in 2018 when compared to 2010. And really, when you have a falling or declining technology costs against an inclining or rising prices of electricity, it's almost a perfect recipe to go ahead and look at alternate technologies. So colleagues, this is pretty much a quick summary of why we've seen such a huge interest or push in the space of small-scale embedded generation. Just getting out from there, now that we have a clear understanding as to why we're having this push, we're now going into the space of looking at the changes in the electricity sector. So obviously, when you start getting an alternate form of electricity being born, you're obviously then going to find a change in the electricity sector. And when we start unpacking the changes in the electricity sector, look, I think it's important to understand that there's going to be a shift in the electricity usage and the generation topologies by customers. And if we very quickly look at the past, when the grid was available in the past, a normal customer had the grid and a connection to his house. When the grid was not available in the past, the customer would either stay off, or in some cases, if the customer did employ a fossil fuel generator. But by and large, the customer stayed without electricity. In the present case, or the present scenario, when the grid is available, we're seeing more and more of solar PV being connected to the home as well as to the grid. And when the grid is not available, we're starting to see more and more of solar PV, battery storage, and in some cases coupled with fuel-fired generators. Going into the future, you can see that things are going to start to look very different. You can see when the grid is available, we're expecting to see houses now connected to the grid. We're expecting to see solar PV as well as battery storage as well. And when the grid is unavailable, we're then going to see the home, the solar PV panel, as well as the battery. So if you look at where we started off in the past, and if you look at where we're going into the future, it is fairly obvious that the generation topologies have now changed in the country, and the way in which we need to respond to our customers needs to change as well. The two graphs on the right-hand side, I think, bears testament to the fact that the rising solar PV is not only in South Africa. I think it's then throughout the world. If you look at the graph on the top right-hand corner, you'll see that in 2008, we started off with something like 15 gigawatts in the world. And in 2018, we're sitting somewhere with 505 gigawatts. So a huge amount of ramping when it came to solar PV. If you look at some of the countries that are the leaders thus far, we're looking at the likes of China, the US, Japan, Germany, India, and then Italy. And I think just to maybe put into perspective the scale at which people are taking on solar PV. I mean, if you look at Germany here, they're talking something like 50 gigawatts. And if you make that comparison now back to the South African context, where I remember we had an installed capacity somewhere around 40 gigawatts, it just tells you that Germany can power the entire of South Africa just using their solar PV systems. So really, a lot of the countries are embracing the technology, and they're starting to push in line with the new regime of moving towards renewable energy. The next part now was a very important part, and I could go on talking to you for days around the tariff structures, but I try to limit it to 2 slides. Because when you start seeing the changes in the electricity sector, now you start seeing changes or disruptions to your traditional electricity tariff structures. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time just to give you a little bit of context around the situation at eThekwini. If we then just look at our customer base, we're broadly broken up into 3 areas. The one being the residential customer base, the second one being the business customer base, and the third one being industrial. The residential customer base brings in something like 4.3 billion based on the 2019-2020 financial year. Businesses bring in 3 billion, and our industry brings in 4.9 billion. And I think what's interesting to note is that if you look at our customer numbers, there's 325,000 customers that are on the credit tariff and 397,000 customers on the prepaid tariff. If you look at the income that we get from the customer base, 325,000 customers on the credit tariff bring in 75% of 4.3 billion, and 397,000 customers bring in 25% of 4.3 billion. Okay, so you can really see which customers in the city are using electricity and which customers are really using low consumptions of electricity. Now, the area that I want to concentrate on here under the residential customer base is to talk to you about the way in which we are recovering network costs. Okay, so the graph on the left-hand side bottom, the first one, you will see that all of the costs of the network is being recovered from the residential sector through a variable charge, both on the credit tariffs and on the prepaid tariffs. Okay, and that really is not a problem, or like it wasn't a problem in the past, because we all behaved the same, so really it's not an issue. But as we go on talking, you'll see where it's becoming a problem for us. If we then start to look at the business sector, we got 44,000 customers on the business sector bringing in 3 billion rand. And if we then look at the recovery of the network costs, 96% of the network costs are recovered through a fixed charge, through a variable charge, and 4% of the network costs are now recovered via a fixed charge. All right, and very quickly, if we go on looking at the industrial customer base, you'll see that on the industrial side, we've got 85% of the 4.9 billion rand that's coming in from 1,000 customers that's being recovered from fixed charges, and 15% then recovered from variable charges. All right, now, really, there's nothing wrong with this type of tariff. It was tariffs that was applicable at the time. You must remember in the past, we had very cheap electricity in the country. We had very good growth, and therefore these tariffs were very appropriate in terms of how we bought and sold electricity. And when you then look at these tariff structures, for example, the residential tariff structure, and you compare it to a cost recovery method, you'll see that when you recover your network costs in the energy rate, there's a high utility risk in terms of recovering those costs, and there's a poor level of cost reflectivity. But if you look at the ease of implementation and customer understanding, it's extremely easy to implement, and you have a very high customer understanding. So when you try and recover your network costs through your variable energy charges, you have the advantage of being very easy for the customer to understand, and it's very easy to implement. So you can put in a meter, a very, very cheap Ferraris disk meter, for a cost of 90 to 100 Rand, and you could just measure the customer and you can then implement your tariff structure. The problem is the risk to the utility in recovering the costs is very, very high. And it's not a problem if we all behave the same. It becomes a major problem if we start to behave differently. If we then, for example, take the industrial customer base, where you can see that 85% of our network costs are now recovered from the fixed charge, you will see that you fall into this category of the scale, where your utility risk in recovering costs is actually quite low, or it's closer to the lower end of the spectrum. The level of cost reflectiveness of your tariff is actually much higher. The ease of implementation is much harder, and the customer understanding is much lower. So you can see there's pros and cons in terms of what you're trying to do with your tariff structures. And as I said, at that point in time, our tariffs were really good. Now, when you start to implement solar PV, you start to disrupt this sort of harmonious balance that we have within our tariff structures. Now, for those of you that are listening, you would by this time say, well, we could very quickly see that you have the wrong tariff structures. So very simply put, you should be moving them to the correct tariff structures. And that is true. Although it's a little bit harder to implement than how we can say it in words. If we then just take the residential sector, and this information is a little bit dated, and I'm glad that we're undergoing a new cost of supply study. So we're obviously going to start to relook at some of these numbers under the new conditions that we find ourselves in. But what you can see in this graph is the contribution based on a customer usage pattern. So you can then see a customer that uses 500 kilowatt hours, or a customer that consumes up to 500 Rand from the grid, makes a contribution of 500 Rand towards the grid. All right. A customer's bill of 3,000 Rand will make a contribution of 3,000 Rand to the grid, of 3,000 kilowatt hours, sorry, will make a contribution of 3,000 Rand to the grid. And what this graph is actually then showing you is that because we have such a high dependency on volumetric tariffs, the more you consume, the more you will contribute towards network costs of the city. Okay, and that's the model that we've actually been using all along, because we had volumetric tariffs. Now the problem comes in is that if you then look at the point of fair contribution, or a cost reflective point, somewhere sitting around 500 Rand, you can then see that we've got 450,000 customers that's below this point, and we've got something like 180,000 customers that's above this point. And pretty much what it's saying to you is that we've got 180,000 customers in the residential customer category that's subsidizing 450,000 customers. And when you start to unpack those numbers, you'll realize that changing the tariffs is not going to be that easy to do. Now, I agree that we need to start moving towards cost-reflective tariff structures. And cost-reflective tariff structures is simple when we're talking about it from a technical point of view. But I think when we start addressing the social dynamics when it comes to moving to cost-reflective tariffs, I think it becomes a bit more complicated. And really, I'm not of the view that we must start providing technical solutions to social problems. And therefore, when we're starting to move our tariffs from non-cost reflective to cost reflective, we must tread very, very carefully. The other problem we have when we're trying to move to cost reflective tariffs, at the same time, whilst we're introducing renewable energy, it almost gives the perception that the prices of electricity in the country to certain communities are increasing because of the introduction of renewable energy. And it's really not the right plight or the right frame or picture that we want to paint, because that's not the case. So in my view, we've always stayed away from the cost reflective side of the tariff and then moving to renewable energy tariffs. And whilst I agree that we need to have cost reflective tariffs to ensure we can design proper renewable energy tariffs, I think if we dovetail the two too closely, we may end up with a problem on trying to motivate what we're trying to do on the social side of this equation. Just very quickly, and without spending too much more time, another area that I'd like to focus on, just to give you an indication of the vast buying and selling mismatch that we have with our tariff structures. If you then look at a typical, if you look at eThekwini as being a typical municipality, we buy electricity from Eskom, one on a seasonal tariff rate, and we also buy it on time of use tariff rates. So we buy it from Eskom on time of use and seasonal, but we sell to customers on flat rates. And really in the past it wasn't a problem, but as Eskom tariffs started to become more and more cost reflective, and Eskom started to pass on the costs of doing business on an hourly basis, we are now finding ourselves, and this is the 2021 tariff structures 2022, in the winter peak period. We're buying from Eskom at R4.56. We're selling to our residential customer base at R2.40. We're actually losing R2.16 per kilowatt hour. During the standard times, we're buying at R1.38. We're selling to our customer base at R2.40. And so the contribution then to the municipality is R1.02. And then in the off-peak, we're buying at 75 cents. We're selling at R2.40. And the contribution then to the municipality is R1.65. So we have a real mismatch between how we're buying and how we're selling our electricity. And this is not creating a problem. If we all behave the same, then there's enough diversity within the municipality for us to average out these periods and break even. All right, and we've been doing it now for a number of years. So we take the loss in the peak period, we sell at a slightly higher rate in the standard and the off-peak, we cover up, and then we break even at the end of the day. If you now go ahead and you introduce solar PV, and this is a typical generation profile that's up on the screen. And for example, if you take 6 to 9, which is your peak period, you'll see that the solar PV generation system is just starting to generate at this point in time. All right. This is the time, though, that we are subsidizing you as a municipality. We then reliant on you using electricity during the period from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But during this time, your PV system is now generating. So you're actually off the grid during this period of time. And that generator now does not contribute to that standard tariff to help us cover up for the subsidization we did in the peak period. And then if you look at the afternoon peak, which then runs from 5 to 7, you will see that the generation system is not working at all. So once again, you get subsidized by the municipality. So you see, we're starting to interfere with the way in which we break even as a municipality. And as I said, if we all behave the same, then our current revenue model works quite nicely. Once we start to deviate in terms of our actions, then very quickly you see we start to break the revenue recovery model for the municipality. So colleagues, I hope I was just able to just articulate very quickly some of the arguments around the difficulties that we're having with the tariff structures. Very quickly, I'm noticing that we are running out of time a little bit. I'm going to run through what we call the debt spiral very, very quickly. If you then look at the picture on the top left-hand side of your screen, you'll see the definition of what is being deemed to be the utility debt spiral. And it starts off by saying that once you see your sales declining as the electricity department, we would then increase our electricity prices to recover the costs. And that is the truth. That's our current revenue business model. The customer then will receive his bill. And the customer then says, look, this is becoming too expensive for me. I would like to then look at ways of reducing the bills. The customer then goes ahead and looks at energy efficiency options, or the customer will then look at alternate energy, being small scale embedded generation. Once that happens, the electricity sales starts to decline once more. We as a municipality have to then pick up the prices even more to ensure that we can meet our requirements in terms of the budget. The customer then looks at his bill, starts to then do more energy efficiency or move towards more of the small scale embedded generation. We start to then trigger the debt spiral. And colleagues, as we speak right now, if you look at the graph that I showed you very early on, with our sales going down the way in which it's going down, we most probably trigger the debt spiral already within the municipality. The good thing is we're still closer to the utility, to the sustainable utility point. And if you now focus your view on the graph on the picture at the bottom right, you'll see that the impact of the debt spiral is declining energy usage, which is happening right now in the municipality. It's declining income. It's declining contribution to subsidies. It's inclining electricity tariffs. And we're starting to see a shift in the subsidy recovery mechanism. So if you look at all the triggers and everything that's happening right now, we seem to be following the path of triggering the utility debt spiral. And the good thing is we're at the very start of it, so we can very quickly make decisions or take decisions to ensure that we don't go down the spiral as a municipality. If we then starting to look at what is the solution to not trigger the debt spiral, look, I think it starts off with number one, to redesign your tariff structures and your rates. Secondly, to separate your energy and your wires charges. Thirdly, to maintain your subsidy contributions. And fourthly, to price discriminate against price elastic customers. So I think these are the four principal points that we need to follow in terms of the redesign of our tariff structure to ensure that we don't end up being an unsustainable utility based on the tariff structures that we have right now. If we go through the various pieces of literature, there's a view amongst authors that because as an electricity unit or as an electricity utility, we are highly regulated. And it's highly unlikely that we will follow the route of a debt spiral, because there's an expectation that the regulator will step in and prevent it from happening. But the reality is right now, as we stand, we seem to be pressing the right buttons in terms of starting the utility debt spiral. Just very quickly, I'm going to run through some of the best practice approaches when we start looking at how we need to start treating embedded generation, how we need to start making some of those changes. And if you look at the current situation is where we are, we've got a line coming in from the utility through your electricity meter going into your home. We then charge you for electricity that you use from the grid. Very simple, and as I said, it was fit for purpose at the time. Right now, the situation has changed in the country. We as municipalities need to adopt a far more complicated approach in terms of how we provide the service to the customer. From a tariffing perspective, number one, there will have to be a charge for grid usage. Number two, there has to be a charge, call it an added charge, to cater for the loss in grid contributions and to cater for the subsidies. The reality is that subsidies are real. They exist. We have to somehow be able to compromise based on the subsidies. We're then going to introduce a charge for energy that you export onto the grid. So there will be times when your solar PV system is generating and your profile of your load is not in sync with the profile of your generator. You will then be allowed to sell that electricity back to the municipality. We would then have an export meter or an export register within a single meter. And finally, the last charge that we're going to introduce for you is through your import meter charge, and this is for all the electricity that you consume from the network. So as you can see, we need to now make a transition from the picture on the top left to the picture on the bottom right. It's not an easy transition to make because we need to start asking ourselves the question, do we have the correct policies in place? Do we have the correct regulation in place? Do we have the correct meters? Do we have the correct billing system? Do we have the correct safety measures? And you can see making a very simple transition changes the entire status quo of the municipality when it comes to dealing with these types of issues. Just sorry, colleagues, before we move off this aspect, I just want to run through quickly some of the international norms that other countries have adopted when it came to dealing with the embedded generation. Some of the countries looked at net metering as an option. And once again, I've just put it onto a scale to show you that net metering is very, very simple to implement. But as you can see that from a sustainability point, the utility, it's not something that we want to promote, because what you end up doing is that you offset the customer for electricity generated at the same rate as what the customer paid for that electricity. So it doesn't really make sense in the case of eThekwini at this point in time. The better option that we felt that would work for us is the issues around net billing. We've adopted a net billing approach. And the reason why we did this is because we're able to then pass a credit to the customer through his electricity bill. And we found that we were able to then also implement a fixed charge to help us compensate for that loss in electricity as well. So the other options available is the buy all, sell all mechanism, as well as the feed-in tariffs. But if you then look into these tariffs in greater detail, you'll see that it's not ideally suited for the conditions of eThekwini municipality. So the method that we agreed upon in terms of implementing for the embedded generation tariffs was based on the principle of net billing. And then just the last part in terms of our understanding, when we look at renewable energy, I think we have to look at it in two prongs as a municipality, because we as a city, we've also set renewable energy targets. And if you look at the carbon emissions for the city, you'll see that 40% of our emissions in the city is due to the usage of electricity. All right. And so our climate change department felt that we really need to start looking at how we make this transition to renewable energy. And based on that, we set targets in the city, and we set quite ambitious targets, I have to be honest. By the year 2030, we want to then try and bring in 40% of renewable energy into the city. And by the year 2050, we want to bring in 100% of renewable energy into the city. So it was quite important that whatever decision we took in terms of the designing of this framework to bring on board renewable energy, we had to make sure that we were taking into consideration meeting these targets in terms of climate change means as well. All right, so colleagues, that then brings us to the end of the first part in terms of understanding the disruption. And I'm then very quickly going to move into understanding the approach. Now, we were sitting here understanding what the problem is, and we actually then knew where we're going to fall short in this entire program. What we didn't really understand is exactly how much we're going to lose as a municipality, and it was something that we needed to get a hold of. We then decided to build a techno-economic model, and I'm just going to try with this slide to just explain to you very quickly how the model actually worked. So we went to our GIS system as a municipality, and if you go into satellite view, we then pretty much had this aerial view of all the houses that we have within the municipality. Okay, so we knew where you're located. What we then did was we linked to every single house your electricity usage. Once we linked your electricity usage to that property, look, we then linked your electricity tariff to that property as well. So now we were in a situation where we knew exactly where you were located. Look, we knew how much of electricity you use, and we knew how much we charge you for that electricity. Then we went a step further and said, well, so we know how the sun shines in Durban, and that's pretty uniform and stable throughout the city. And we also know what the PV costs are. So if we then bring all of this information together, we can then very quickly calculate the optimum PV size for each household within the city. And we're fortunate that we were able to get all those bits of information. And based on that, we then calculated what would be the optimum PV size that every single household will put into their homes based on the cost of electricity and based on the cost of PV. That then gave us an opportunity to work out the energy drop per customer. We then calculated the financial loss per customer. And based on that, we then quantified the bounds of risk that we will face as a municipality. And it actually worked out quite nicely because it gave us a nice range of where we actually see the losses to be when it came to the integration of embedded generation. I'm going to very quickly go through the model, and I'm not going to go through all of the details. We are running out of time a little bit. But this is just a view of the solar techno-economic modeling tool that we actually built. I think it's going to add a little bit of value if we then look at the model inputs and the model outputs. As you can see, there was a range of inputs, which is your picture on the left-hand side. And there was a range of things that we put into the model to ensure we can get the necessary outputs. And the things that we were looking for of interest in terms of the output was your internal rate of return, your levelized cost of electricity, your return on investment, and your payback period. And that was pretty much the very important aspects that we wanted out of the model, because we based the model on an investment criteria or a sort of economic criteria. And so these were the sort of four things that we were looking for to come out of the model. The model was quite comprehensive. We included many things. We included the SARS tax rebate, cost of the PV system, maintenance cost, the cost of insurance. So it went into quite a bit of detail in terms of what we put in, and there was quite a bit of information that we got out. But for the purpose of the conversation today, I just want us to focus on the payback period, the return on investment, and the internal rate of return. Those are the three key outputs that allowed us to make some reasonable judgments around who and how PV should be taking off in the city or will be taking off in the city. The next slide is once again just some of the outputs. It's just a graphical user interface that's showing a bit of the outputs in terms of the techno-economic model. Okay, so colleagues, it was very quick. I just had to go through that quite quickly because I want to spend just a little bit of time on understanding what the financial risks of introducing solar PV to the city was. So let's just get into here very quickly. And before we talk about that, look, I just want to run through very quickly of what is the current status in terms of solar PV projects based on the current tariff structures that we have. So the graph at the top, it's now split up into three of our customer categories, being residential, business, and industry. And what we found is that when we model these customers and when we put on these PV systems onto their roofs, and when we then looked at that against what they're paying for electricity, we're able then to calculate an internal rate of return for each one of these projects. We then aggregated that to then arrive at a figure on average for each customer base. You will then see, so if we did nothing as a city, and if we allowed these projects to go ahead in the residential customer base, they should see returns of something like 16.18% in terms of a rate of return, and they should be able to pay back their systems in a period of 8 years or so. If you then look at the business sector, they're seeing internal rates of returns of 28%, and they're seeing average paybacks of 4 years. And if you look at industry, they're seeing internal rates of returns of 24% and average payback periods of 5 years. Now, if you then look at the residential sector, it shows that only 34% of the people in Durban meet the feasibility criteria to go and install solar PV. And that's a very small number if you look at it from a residential point of view. On the business side, you'll see that 94% of businesses in Durban were feasible to go ahead and install solar PV. And from an industry point of view, there was 100% of the people that were feasible. Now, I just want to pause at this point and raise a very important aspect here. If you remember earlier on when we're talking about the residential tariffs, you noticed that our tariffs was a single energy charge. It was a single variable charge that consists of two components. The one was the energy cost from Eskom, and the one was the municipal costs that now we push towards the grid. Okay, and because of the volumetric nature of the tariff design, we built those two costs into one single charge. And then when you're calculating now your solar PV feasibility, you're now offsetting the municipal costs as well as the Eskom energy costs in that single energy charge. And that is unfair because when you put in your PV system, you are not augmenting or changing the cost of the grid. The only thing you are doing for the municipality is that you're reducing the Eskom costs. So when your electricity tariff rate is at R2.40, when you install your PV system, the only thing that you're offsetting from the R2.40 is 54% of that, which is roughly around just over R1. And unfortunately, we've been then seeing situations where these projects were taking on the windfall profit as a result of having the tariff structure designed in that fashion. And then you'll see in the business customer category, when you then consolidate that with your loading pattern being very similar to your generation pattern, and you gaining this additional tariff infeed, you'll see that it makes absolute sense for the business sector to capitalize on our poor tariff structures and go ahead and install solar PV, and hence the wonderful internal rates of returns that we're seeing here as well. So because we have the tariff structures the way they are, it created this false perception of how good or how lucrative solar PV actually was, because you were actually offsetting the costs that should be coming to the municipality as energy costs, and in that way you were getting this windfall gain in terms of the calculation. Right, so I just wanted to make that point on that slide. And then very quickly, you heard me speaking about feasibility criteria. And when I went through the model, I spoke to you around the payback period as well as the internal rate of return. Because the one question that we had to ask ourselves is, what is going to be the trigger for people to install solar PV? Now, some people would do it because they're just fed up of load shedding and they'd like to just bring in solar PV with batteries to try and get off the grid. And that's going to be just a very expensive exercise, but some people would do that. Some people then would do it because they obviously want to contribute to a lower carbon emission, and that might be possible. But we've taken the approach through the study that people would do it if it made financial sense. And in saying that, what we did was we said, if a customer had 50,000 Rand to invest in a solar PV system, where would they get the best bang for their buck? And then we went out into the market and we looked at 5 major asset classes, being equity, bonds, cash, property, and gold. And if you invested this money over a 20-year period, for example, in equity, which is your gray bar, you'll see that your return was less than 10%. Bonds was somewhere between 5 and 10. Cash, below 5. Property, just under 10. Gold, just over 5% as well. And so the idea was then, we've taken the view that customers would put their money where they would get a highest internal rate of return. If you looked at the market as it stands right now, everyone's sitting somewhere around 10 to 12% at maximum when you look at a 10-year period, but over a 20-year period, they're sitting way below 10%. And so we then said, well, if we offer customers a 15% internal rate of return and a payback period below 10 years, it's going to satisfy the feasibility criteria to say that customers would now go ahead and install solar PV. And colleagues, that was then used as a feasibility criteria within the model to say whether a customer would install solar PV or not. All right, so with those two things out of the way, let's quickly then go in to see what then would be the financial impact as a maximum bound then for the municipality. What we then experienced or saw that from a revenue loss point of view, we would lose 556 billion rand from the residential sector, we'd lose 283 million rand from the business sector, and we'd lose just over like 120 million from industry. Whilst we're losing that money, we're also gaining the renewable megawatts, and there's going to be 530 megawatts potentially generated from the residential sector, 229 from the business sector, and 492 megawatts from the industrial sector. Now it's obvious, look, I don't think everybody is going to go and install solar PV. So this graph here then just gives us a breakdown. If we look at it based on the penetration rates of customers, you can see if only 10% of the customers respond, we'll generate just over 120 megawatts, and we lose something like 96 million. So really, the quantum of the problem that we will face as a municipality will be highly dependent on the amount of customers that take up this technology and the amount of customers that have the appetite to actually go and install these types of technologies. All right, and then also just to put into perspective, if you look at 959 million, just under a billion. If you look at our budget as the electricity unit within the municipality, we're somewhere around now 17 billion rand. And from that, we got something like 12.5, 13 billion rand that goes directly to Eskom. So we're sitting with roughly around 4 to 5 billion rand. That's the money that we use to run the municipality. These costs that I'm talking to you about right now, or these losses, are net to the municipality. So it means that we could lose up to 1 billion rand on that 4 to 5 billion rand that we get in from the customer base. So it's quite substantial, and it really depends on how high of a penetration rate so we're going to get when it comes to these systems. Right, so colleagues, we've done with understanding the financial risk. I just want to very quickly run through the solutions. And when it came to the solution, as I mentioned earlier on, look, we had to play this very delicate balancing act in one, trying to optimize the quantity of renewable energy we have, because as a city, on one hand, we've already set renewable energy targets, and we should not be seen as going against those targets. But at the same time, as the electricity unit, we have the responsibility and the function to ensure that we remain sustainable. So there was two things that we were trying to balance each time. One is to ensure we remain sustainable. Two, to ensure that we optimize our potential to reach our renewable energy targets. And I just want to quickly show you, look, we ran quite a few scenarios, and I'm sorry for not giving you the details around the scenarios. But what I want to illustrate through this graph is to then actually show you that depending on what we do, it will influence how we reach our targets, both being our 2030 renewable energy targets and our 2050 renewable energy targets. You'll see in scenario 4, we've designed the tariff structures in a specific manner, and you obviously see that we deviate from the 2030 target by 100%, and we deviate from the 2050 target by 100% as well. If we then look at scenario 6, which was the scenario that we adopted as a municipality, we would get on board 775 megawatts in a good case, and we'll deviate then from the 2030 target by 5%, we'll deviate then from the 2050 target by 67%. So we have to just play this balancing act each time to ensure that whatever we did in terms of strengthening our tariffs did not go against the principles of trying to reach our renewable energy targets as the city. Our approach then was to respond to each customer category individually and then based on the feasibility of the projects. And what we then found is that if we designed our renewable energy tariffs to augment our loss to zero, all right, which means that we introduced all of these fixed charges and whatever, what we noticed is that none of the residential customers would meet the feasibility criteria. 85% of the business customers would meet your feasibility criteria, and 100% of your industrial customers would meet the feasibility criteria. So if we went ahead and designed our tariffs to ensure that there's zero loss to us, the business and the industrial customers would still be very happy in the city. Unfortunately, though, our residential customers would not be happy because our tariff structures would not then be promoting solar PV from a residential perspective. If we then look at the graph on the top left, and I just want to concentrate there on the slide, you'll see that if we implemented the tariff structures to bring our losses down to zero, the average internal rate of projects for the residential sector was around 10.5% with a payback of 11 years. For the business sector, it was 18.27% and a payback of 7 years. And for the industrial sector, it was 20.7% with an average payback of 6.42 years. So you'd see in the business and the industrial space, although we're bringing in these additional tariff charges, and not that we want to, but because we have to in terms of balancing this entire regime, you'll see that the feasibility of the project still remain reasonably good. And that was then the basis around which we started to then implement the tariff structures so within the city. Finally then, oh sorry, and just before, look, I think one more thing before I leave this section, I just want to very quickly give you a feel for how that impacted on the current tariff structures. So if you look at the residential tariff, all the areas in white is the existing tariff, all the areas in yellow are the new tariff components that we added on. So if you then bought electricity from the grid as a residential customer, we charge you R1.97. And sorry, this is the old tariff rate, so it may deviate a little bit. There is no service charge to you as a customer. But for every kilowatt hour that you generate onto the grid, we will credit you at R1 per kilowatt hour for that. And we're now introducing a fixed network access charge based on the size of your inverter. And that works out to being R87.73 per kVA per month. So the bigger your inverter, the more you are deviating from grid usage, and the more then we're trying to then recover in terms of your grid contribution. And it's the very same principle that we applied to our business tariffs, but then you'll notice that the rate of feed-in for the business customer category was a little bit lower than the residential, and that's purely based on the load profile of the business customer category against his generation profile, and we then worked it out in terms of what is the net to us as a municipality. And I want to say at this point, because I think it's appropriate, that when we designed these tariffs, it was all meant to be revenue neutral. So if we look at the amount of credit that we're giving to the customer, it's a credit that we're giving to the customer purely based on the Eskom tariff structures. So if we don't buy this kilowatt hour from the embedded generator, we would then buy this kilowatt hour from Eskom itself. If we then look at the network access charges that we introduced into these tariff structures, it was not an additional charge. It is a charge that was introduced so that we don't lose the revenue from the customer. So by introducing these tariffs in this fashion, we as a municipality remain revenue neutral as we make this transition to embedded generation. And I think it's important to note that, because it comes across as though municipalities want to capitalize on this opportunity and obviously get more revenue from customers. It is not the case. These tariffs are completely revenue neutral. And the idea is that we're implementing the charges in this fashion to ensure that we can maintain what we had previously. All right, colleagues, and I'm not going to get into the industrial tariff option, which is the table on your left-hand side. It gets quite complicated, but I think I just want to leave this section on the basis of saying that we wanted to quantify the losses to the municipality, and we've done that. We then implemented our tariffs to try and manage these losses to us, and this is the mechanism that we're proposing to implement to better manage this entire situation. And finally, we want to get to a point where we mitigate the losses altogether. And hopefully we'll be able to do that in the near future. Colleagues, I know I'm running very, very close to time, and this is then going to be my last slide for the talk today. I just want to then give you a sense of what then has been the impact of implementing these tariffs to the municipality. And if you look at the management component of this, you will notice for the residential sector, we had initially the loss to us sitting at 588 million as a worst case scenario. We then decided to implement our tariffs at 20% of the value. So on the previous slide, you saw for the residential customer base, the tariff was around 80 somewhat rand per kVA per month. We're now saying that just to introduce this cost to the market, to just gauge the appetite of our customers, we're going to then introduce the tariff charge at 20% of its value for 5 megawatts of generation on the residential customer base. It then limits our loss as a municipality down to 4 million rand. For the business customer base, we said that we're going to implement the charge at 30% of its value, and we'll allow up to 30 megawatts of generation to go through in phase 1. It then brings down our revenue financial risk from 360 million down to 21 million rand. And if we then look at the industrial customer base, we then said that we implement the charge at 70% of its value. Therefore, our losses are then limited to 30%, and will allow up to 50 megawatts of generation to go through under the first phase of this program. So colleagues, what you then see is on the top, if we do not implement the solution, we sit here with an exposure of something close to 1 billion rand in terms of our revenue losses. If we then implement these tariffs and the proposals, we then see that our losses are then limited to somewhere around 30 million. And when you listen to these figures as a municipal accountant, I think you feel a lot better knowing that we're in control of these losses and we know what we're actually trying to do. Ideally, we'd like to mitigate the losses, but I think if we do mitigate the losses, we'll be sending the wrong signal to the people. And once again, it's this balancing act in trying to do this as best as we possibly can. So colleagues, I think my last statement then in terms of the talk for this afternoon, I just want to say to you all that if we find a way to share the losses, and if we find a way to share the gain, then I think we can successfully make this renewable energy transition. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Lishan, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. We have got around about 20 minutes for questions, and I have some questions which I'd like to read out. The first is from Georgia Bear, who says, how do you handle theft and vandalism? Throwing money in a bottomless pit to fix equipment over and over is impossible. I think we all of those that have been in the utility have experienced this. But if you've got any comments on that, Lishan, thank you.
Thanks, thank you, Chair, for that question. Yeah, I think it's really a difficult problem to be handling as a utility. Initially when we started off, the levels of theft and vandalism that we're experiencing as a municipality was reasonably low, and it was something that we're able to manage with a very small team of people. But what we start to see happening is that there seems to be more and more of it happening over and over again. And the reality is that every time we try and build a technical solution, it's just a matter of time before that technical solution gets overridden by these people. And once again, we come back to this issue around we're trying to use a technical solution to solve a social problem. So yeah, look, I don't know what the answer is, Chair. Look, we as a municipality as well are struggling with sort of similar challenges. The one area on the issue around illegal connections, we have taken an approach as a municipality to try and legalize those connections. So we're trying to make as much legal connections go out there as possible. But the issues around vandalism, Chair, we're just trying to build bigger structures, trying to make our structures stronger. But as I'm saying, it's just a matter of time before we get those things penetrated through. So, Chair, I don't know what the correct answer is, and I'm hoping that we can get a bit of a more socially inclined approach to try and resolve some of these issues.
Thanks, Lishan. It could be a good topic for future webinars. The next question is from Jason Naika. If the higher consumption users subsidize the lower end, then there is a high risk of the high-end users moving to renewables. Therefore, the model starts to fail. Similarly, having a fixed network charge per customer also unaffordable for prepaid users. Any comments on that?
Yes, Chair, and I think Jason hit the nail on the head perfectly. But there's two aspects, I think, to that question. And the first aspect was where he mentioned that the high consumption customers will be the ones that will be moving off the grid because it's more than likely that they can afford to do that. And when they do move off the grid, they will take with them their subsidy mechanism and portion that we will not have to cross-subsidize the others. Hence, then we're saying that we will start to introduce these fixed charges to specific bands of customers at this point in time. So we're not going to be introducing fixed charges to the prepayment sector. It's going to be an absolute nightmare to administer that. And what we're then saying is that for customers that want to behave differently at this point in time, the manner in which we're going to recover our network charges from you is going to be in the form of a fixed charge. And for exactly the same reason is that we're not trying to move everybody onto fixed charges at this point in time. We're trying to only move customers that are taking on this transition. We're trying to move them at this point in time to fixed charges. And later on, when we're trying to implement cost-reflective tariffs, we're going to try and bring everybody else on board. I personally don't think that we are ready as a municipality, nor are we ready, I think, as a country, if you look at the economy and the level of affordability, to start talking about shifting cross-subsidy mechanisms. So, Chair, from our side, that's the reason why we've taken that phased approach to roll in the fixed charges to specific customers at this point in time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lishan. Just a comment here from Sianda. It said, thank you, Lishan and eThekwini, for sharing the info at SAIEE and SAIEE-KZN. We need at least a 4-hour session for this topic. But it might be something to consider because you covered an enormous amount of very important information here, which I think will be very useful to other municipalities. So thanks for that comment there, Sianda. Then a question from old colleague of mine, Maurice van Rensburg. Very good presentation. Do you look at the time of use tariffs for everybody? That would send the correct signal in terms of consumption.
Very nice question, and you are perfectly correct. I've always taken the view, and just based on the previous comment you got from one of the listeners, we could go on talking about this topic for most probably weeks. You know, we definitely, as municipalities, have to take the approach of moving towards time of use tariffs. If you look at what's been happening to municipalities in terms of the Eskom tariff structures, we've now been moved almost to time of use tariffs in terms of our purchasing tariff. And that's perfectly correct because Eskom is now trying to pass on a pricing signal through time of use. The problem is that if we as municipalities cannot pass on the same tariff to our customers, we're not passing on that pricing signal. And hence you saw, it's one of my slides, where the cost of electricity in the winter peak is more than 5 Rand a kilowatt hour, but none of my customers see it downstream. So ideally, the right thing that we should be doing as municipalities is passing on exactly the tariffs we get from Eskom to our customer base. The problem, though, that we're finding ourselves in is how then do we start to introduce time of use tariffs to the residential customer base? It now comes with a huge amount of responsibility in terms of upgrading your metering infrastructure, in terms of upgrading your communication infrastructure. And it's a huge change to get people to understand that you will pay 5 Rand per kilowatt hour during the morning peaks when you need to use that electricity. And so once again, whilst we can provide a technical solution in terms of providing the smart meters and the backend infrastructure and everything else, we have to have the social conversation. Are we ready as a country to be charging customers 5 Rand a kilowatt hour during winter peaks? You know, so I agree 100% with that comment that time of use tariffs is the route that we should be going. We actually have time of use tariffs designed. We're just waiting for the opportune moment to start launching these tariff structures. But for now, look, I don't think it's going to be the right route because we just cannot deal with some of the social aspects when it comes to the introduction of that tariff structure.
Thank you. Then there's a comment, just a comment from Bram Peralt. He said, many thanks for a good view into the municipal situation. And you covered a lot of ground in a very short time, which we can all agree with. Then there's a question from Walter Maliwa. Where does NERSA come into your tariff plans? I think this is the approval of the particular tariffs that you're proposing relating to grid charges, rand per kVA, and so on. You would obviously need to work through NERSA. Do you want to comment on that?
Chair, that is correct. NERSA did launch guidelines in terms of small-scale embedded generated tariffs, and our tariff structures have been designed around those guidelines by and large. But all municipal distributors have to submit their tariffs to NERSA for approval, and we then did the same. Look, we obviously had to motivate our tariffs as well to NERSA. It did take us some time and back and forth between NERSA and ourselves, but NERSA is then the ultimate regulator that takes a decision as to whether we can roll out the tariffs or not. Thanks.
Excellent. I think then that is the end of the questions, and I would like to just state that if there are any more questions, we can pick them up and we can have them answered via email. And I'd like to now hand back to the KZN Centre Chair, Shepherd Nkosi. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens. Thank you so much, Lishan, for the detailed presentation. And I also concur with the attendees that really the information that you've shared this afternoon, it requires more time. And I'm sure you've taken notes of your future presentations, because it's clear that we might be needing you again. And there's a lot that would like to have discussion with you with regards, obviously, some of the developments that you've shared with us this afternoon. It was really a captivating presentation that you've shared with us, and we thank you for that and your patience in giving us all the details. It was wonderful. And to all our attendees, thank you for attending the SAIEE technical talk today. Visit the SAIEE webinar on the www.saie.org.za for upcoming webinars. There's few webinars that are scheduled before end of this year, and we look forward to seeing you joining us via this online platform. Thank you. The webinar is closed.